You know that feeling when the sky turns the wrong color, and your stomach drops a little, even before the first drop of rain hits you. That's what I remember most, not the screaming, not the sirens later, just that sky. It was the kind of gray that didn't belong to London in October, too dark, too low, like the clouds had come down to listen to something. I was standing across from the gates of Buckingham Palace that afternoon, eating a cold sausage roll out of a paper bag, because I'd skipped lunch and my train back to Reading wasn't until 6. I'm not even a royal fan, to be honest. I came down for a job interview in Victoria that morning and thought, well, I'm here, might as well walk past the palace. Tick a box, send a photo to my mum. There were maybe 200 people gathered along the railings, maybe more. Tourists with phones held high, a school group in matching yellow caps, a French family arguing softly about which guard was the real one, a girl in a wheelchair near the front, her dad crouched beside her, pointing things out. And then the wind changed. I felt it before I saw it, that cold push against my back, sharp enough to make me turn around. The flags above the palace started snapping like wet towels. A vendor's umbrella across the street folded inside out. Someone laughed. Someone else swore. Within 90 seconds, it was raining. Not the polite English drizzle you expect. This was something else. It came sideways, heavy. The kind of rain that soaks through a coat in under a minute and makes your shoes squelch with every step. People scattered. They always do. Tourists are funny like that. They'll stand in the cold for 40 minutes to see a man in a bearskin hat, but the moment the sky opens up, they remember they have hotels to get back to. Half the crowd was gone within 2 minutes. The rest huddled under the trees on the far side or pressed themselves flat against the gates, hoping the wind would forget them. But I noticed her because she didn't move. The girl in the wheelchair. Her dad was still beside her, but he was struggling. The wind had taken her little plastic rain cape and twisted it backwards over her head, and he was trying to fix it with one hand while holding his phone with the other, talking to someone, shouting really, because the wind was that loud now. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, skinny arms, a pink hat that the rain had already flattened against her skull. She wasn't crying. That's what got me. She was just sitting there looking up at the sky like she was trying to understand it. I started walking over. I don't know why. Something in me just said go. But before I got there, something else happened. One of the guards moved. Now if you've ever been to the palace, you'll know they don't move. Not really. They shift their weight, sure. Every 10 minutes or so they'll do the slow march along their post and come back. That's it. They're trained to stand there like stone. Rain, snow, tourists tapping the railings, kids shouting, drunk men shouting worse. They don't flinch. But this one did. I saw him turn his head, just a fraction, like he'd heard something the rest of us hadn't. His eyes went to the girl, then to her father, then back to the girl. And then he broke post. I have never seen a royal guard break post before. I've watched the changing of the guard maybe 4 times in my life, on school trips, and once with an ex-girlfriend who liked that sort of thing, and I've never seen one of them so much as scratch their nose. But this one stepped off his platform. He didn't run. He walked, quick but controlled. His boots hit the wet stone with that hard official sound they make, and his rifle stayed exactly where it should, but he was moving, and the whole crowd noticed at once. You could feel it, that ripple. Phones went up. People stopped talking. Even the rain seemed to quiet for a second, though that was probably just my imagination. He went straight to the girl. Her dad looked up, confused, maybe a little scared. You don't expect a man in that uniform to walk towards you. It's a bit like seeing a statue come alive. But the guard didn't say anything. He couldn't, really. They're not supposed to speak on duty. He just bent down, and with one gloved hand, he untangled the rain cape from over the girl's head, smoothed it, tucked it properly under her chin the way you do for your own kid. His other hand stayed on his rifle. And then he did something I'll think about for the rest of my life. He took off his own coat. Now I should explain. The ceremonial coat isn't like a regular coat. It's part of the uniform. It's red, heavy, lined, and it takes them ages to put on properly. Removing it on duty it's not done. It's not just against the rules. It's against everything they stand for. But he undid the buttons with one hand in the rain, with the wind pulling at the fabric, and he draped it over the girl's legs. She looked up at him. Her face changed. I'll never forget that either. It went from blank from that quiet, faraway look to something softer. She smiled, just a small one. Her lips barely moved. And the guard, this big man in his bearskin hat, with rain running down his face like he didn't even feel it, he gave her a tiny nod. Just one. As if to say, "You're all right now." Her dad started crying. I'm not making that up. He just stood there, phone forgotten in his hand, and his shoulders shook. Then the guard straightened up. He took 2 steps back, and he stood there in the rain in his white shirt and braces, with his rifle held exactly the way it was supposed to be held, like nothing had happened. He didn't return to his post, not yet. He stood between the girl and the wind. I don't think people understood at first what they were seeing. There's a moment in things like this, a delay, where the brain catches up with the eyes. I remember a Spanish woman next to me saying something to her husband and pointing, and he just shook his head, like he didn't believe what he was looking at. A teenager near the railings lowered his phone. He'd been filming the whole thing, but he lowered it. I saw him do it, like he didn't want to ruin it by recording it. The rain kept coming. The guard didn't move. His shirt was soaked through within 30 seconds. You could see the outline of his back through the white fabric. His hair, what little I could see under the bearskin, was plastered flat. And he just stood there, eyes forward, jaw set. The little girl, now wrapped in his red coat, looked tiny inside it. The thing nearly swallowed her, but she was warm. You could tell. Her shoulders had relaxed. Her fingers, which had been gripping the armrests of her chair, were loose now. Her dad knelt beside her. He was saying something to her, smiling through tears, and she nodded. And she touched the red sleeve of the coat with one careful finger, like she was afraid it might disappear. I realized I was crying too. I didn't even know when it started. The rain had hidden it well enough. Then came the second guard. He'd been on the post 20 feet down. I hadn't noticed him until he started moving. Same way. Quick, controlled, official. He came up behind the first guard and stood beside him. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't need to. He just stood there, shoulder to shoulder with the other man, his rifle held the same way. And now there were 2 of them, standing between the storm and the girl. This is the part that's hard to explain. I've lived in this country my whole life. I'm 34 years old. I've seen a lot of things. I've stood through Remembrance Day services with my granddad before he passed. I've watched the Queen's funeral on television with my mum, both of us silent on the sofa for hours. I know what the uniform means. I know what the discipline means. But I'd never understood it. Not really. Not until I stood in that rain. Because what those 2 men were doing wasn't just kindness. Kindness is what you do when no one's watching. What they were doing was different. They were on duty, in uniform, representing the crown. Every camera in central London was probably pointed at them. And they had made a choice, both of them, to step off their posts for a little girl in a wheelchair. That's not kindness. That's something heavier than that. That's the kind of thing you only see when a person believes their job means something more than the rules of it. A police officer came over. I didn't see where she came from. She must have been nearby. She had one of those bright yellow jackets and her hat was dripping. She didn't tell the guards to move. I'd half expected her to. I thought maybe she'd radio someone, get them back on their posts, do the official thing. Instead, she crouched down next to the girl. She said something gentle. Then she stood up and turned to the crowd, and she lifted her arms wide, like she was trying to make a wall with her body. "Step back, please," she said. Her voice was loud but kind. "Give them some room, step back." People stepped back. It was strange. The whole crowd, hundreds of soaked tourists, did exactly what she said. No one argued. No one tried to push forward for a better photo. There was just this quiet, this respectful quiet, like we'd all walked into a church without meaning to. The girl's dad was still kneeling. He looked up at the first guard, the one without the coat now, and he tried to say something. Thank you, probably. But his voice didn't work. He just kept opening his mouth and closing it. The guard didn't react. He couldn't. His face stayed forward, eyes locked on some point above the crowd, just like he'd been trained. But I swear his hand moved, just slightly. The one not holding the rifle. His fingers tapped once against his thigh. A signal maybe, or just a small private thing, I don't know. The rain started to ease off. Not stop, but ease. The wind dropped from a howl to a hush. The sky was still gray, still angry, but the worst of it had passed. That was when I heard the ambulance. Now, I want to be careful here, because I didn't know at the time why an ambulance was coming. I assumed maybe someone in the crowd had collapsed, or one of the older tourists had slipped on the wet pavement. But it pulled up close, right by the gates, and two paramedics got out, a man and a woman, and they went straight for the girl. I felt something shift in my chest. Her dad stood up to meet them. He was nodding, wiping his face, talking fast. The woman paramedic put a hand on his shoulder, that practiced gentle touch they have, and she crouched down next to the girl. The girl was still smiling. She still had the red coat around her. The paramedic spoke to her. The girl said something back. I couldn't hear what. And then the paramedic looked up at the guard, the one without the coat, and she nodded at him, just once. The kind of nod that means thank you and well done and I understand all at the same time. He didn't nod back, couldn't, but his jaw moved, you could see it tighten. They lifted her carefully into the ambulance. Her dad carried her wheelchair up the ramp himself. The red coat went with her. The paramedics didn't try to take it off. They wrapped a foil blanket around her on top of it, and the red sleeves stuck out from underneath like wings. The doors closed. The ambulance pulled away. And the two guards finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, walked back to their posts. The one without his coat stood there in his white shirt, soaked through, hair flat, water still running off the brim of his hat. He took up his stance again, rifle in position, eyes forward. He didn't shiver. I was watching for it. He must have been freezing, but he didn't move. A few people in the crowd started clapping. It spread slowly at first, then properly. The teenager who'd put his phone down was clapping the loudest. The French family, the school group, everyone. The guards didn't react. Of course they didn't. But I saw a woman next to me, an older lady with white hair and a tartan scarf, wipe her eyes with the back of her hand and whisper something I didn't quite catch. I asked her what she'd said. She looked at me. She had blue eyes, very pale, the kind that look almost transparent in certain light. I said, she repeated, that's the England I remember. I should have gone home. That's the honest truth. My train was at 6. I had time to walk back to Victoria, dry off in the station, get a coffee, sit on a bench, and forget the whole afternoon ever happened. But I didn't. I stayed in St. James's Park for nearly 2 hours after the ambulance left. I sat on a wet bench under a tree that wasn't doing much to keep the rain off, and I just stared at the gates from a distance. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe for someone to come out and explain what I'd just seen. Maybe for it to feel less heavy in my chest. The crowd thinned out. The school group left. The French family left. Most of the tourists drifted off towards their hotels, towards dinner, towards whatever was next on their list. But a few stayed, mostly the older ones. They stood at the railings without taking photos. They just watched. The guard who'd given up his coat, he was still on his post. They'd brought him a fresh coat from inside, I assume, because by then he had one on again, though it looked slightly different. A bit darker. Maybe a spare. I'm not sure how that works. I don't know all the rules. But what I do know is this. He hadn't been replaced. Most guards have a rotation. They swap out every couple of hours. But him, the one who'd done it, he stayed. I think he wanted to. A man sat down on the bench next to mine. He was older than me, maybe 60, with a gray mustache and a damp tweed cap. He had a folded newspaper under his arm that the rain had ruined. And he sat down with a sigh that suggested his knees weren't what they used to be. "You saw it?" he asked. I nodded. He looked towards the gates. "First time in 50 years, he said. "I've been coming here since I was a lad. My father used to bring me. Stood right by those railings every birthday. 50 years. I've never seen one of them break post." I didn't know what to say. I just said, "Yeah." He sat with that for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you know what's wrong with her?" "The girl." He nodded. "No," I said, "no idea." He hummed low and thoughtful. "I heard one of the tourists say something, could be wrong. They said her dad mentioned a hospital appointment, some sort of treatment. They'd come down to see the palace because she'd asked. Last thing on her list." I felt my throat tighten. "Could be wrong," he said again. "People talk." We sat there a while longer. The rain had stopped properly by then. The sun wasn't out, but the sky had lifted, gone from black to that washed-out white you get after a real storm. "Funny thing," he said eventually, "about uniforms. What about them? People think the uniform makes the man. It doesn't. It's the other way round. A uniform's just cloth. It's the man inside it that gives it meaning." He stood up slowly, tipped his cap and walked off into the park. I never got his name. I missed my train. By the time I realized what time it was already 6:15. I didn't even rush. I sat for another 20 minutes, watching the gates, before I finally got up and started walking towards Victoria. I caught the 7:32, slept most of the way back to Reading, woke up just before my stop and felt like I dreamed the whole thing. But when I got home, when I dropped my bag and kicked off my soaked shoes and stood in the kitchen with the kettle on, I checked my phone. The story was everywhere. I don't mean a small mention. I mean everywhere. BBC News, ITV, Sky. The story had gone up on Twitter, on Facebook, on every platform I had. People had filmed it. The teenager who'd put his phone down hadn't been the only one. There must have been a dozen videos already up, different angles, different moments, all of the same 15 minutes outside the palace. The little girl had a name now. I'm not going to use it here. I don't think it's mine to use. Her family asked for privacy later, and they were right to, but the news had it. They had her age. They had her condition. They had the hospital she was going to. She was 8 years old. And the appointment her dad had mentioned, the one the man on the bench had heard about, it was real. She had been on her way to a treatment session that afternoon. They'd stopped at the palace first because she had asked. She loved royal things. She had pictures of the king and queen on her bedroom wall. Her dad had thought, why not? We have an hour, let's go. They didn't know the storm was coming. They didn't know the wind would catch her cape. They didn't know that someone, that man, would step off his post and do what he did. I read about it standing in my kitchen with the kettle whistling behind me. I didn't move to take it off. I just kept scrolling. The guard's name came out the next morning. I'm not going to use that either. Not properly. I'll call him Daniel because it suits him somehow, and because I think he'd prefer his real name stayed quiet. Daniel was 31. He'd been in the regiment for 9 years. Before that, he'd done 2 tours abroad. He had a wife. No children of his own, but the papers said he was close to his sister's kids. 3 of them, a girl about the same age as the one he'd helped. That's the part that broke me, honestly, when I read that. His sister's girl was 8 too. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed and kept replaying it. The way he untangled the cape with his glove, the way he draped the coat, the small nod, the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, that private little gesture I still don't fully understand. I kept thinking about discipline, about what it costs a person to stand still for hours, about what it must have cost him to break that stillness, even for a moment. And I kept thinking about the storm. There's a particular sound a heavy rain makes when it hits stone, different from when it hits grass or windows or cars. On stone, it's sharper, faster, almost angry. The palace courtyard would have been full of that sound. He must have heard it the whole time he was standing there in his soaked white shirt. I wondered if he was warm now, if he'd had a hot shower and a proper meal, if anyone had told him what the country was saying about him. I wondered if he even cared. The next few days were strange. The story didn't die. If anything, it grew. People who'd been in the crowd started telling their version. The teenager who'd put his phone down did an interview where he cried halfway through and apologized. The Spanish woman who'd been next to me, I recognized her on television. She said it through a translator and her hands shook the whole time. There was a debate in one newspaper about whether the guard should be disciplined. Strictly speaking, he had broken protocol. He had left his post. He had removed an item of uniform. But the debate didn't last long. The palace released a short statement. I won't quote it exactly because I can't remember the precise wording, but the gist was this. The guard had acted with appropriate judgment in unusual circumstances. There would be no formal action. The crown was proud of him. That was that. The papers moved on mostly, but the story stayed with people. You'd hear it mentioned for weeks, in pubs, at work. My mum brought it up 3 times in one phone call. Did you see that guard? Did you see what he did? Yes, Mum, I saw him. I was there. I never told her I'd been there. I don't know why. It felt like the kind of thing you don't share. Like saying it out loud would dilute it. A month passed. Then 2. I went back to my normal life. Got the job, actually, the one in Victoria. Started commuting in 3 days a week. I'd walk past the palace sometimes on my lunch break. I'd glance at the gates, look for him. I never saw him. The guards rotate. He could have been there a dozen times and I wouldn't have known it, not without seeing his face. But one Tuesday in mid-December, I saw something else. I was walking through Green Park with a coffee in my hand, taking the long way back to the office because it was a clear, cold day and I wanted the air. And there, on a bench facing the palace, was a man in civilian clothes, sitting next to a little girl in a wheelchair. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller out of uniform. Just a man in a dark coat with a wool hat pulled low. But the way he sat, that perfectly straight back, the stillness of him, I knew. It was Daniel. And the girl was her. I stopped walking. I shouldn't have stared. It was a private moment, but I couldn't help it. I stood about 30 feet away, behind a tree like an absolute idiot, and I watched them. He was reading to her, from a book. I couldn't see what it was, but the cover was red. She was laughing. That's what I remember most. She was laughing. Her head was tilted back and her mouth was open and her whole face was lit up with it. She had a knitted hat on, a different one from before, blue with a white pompon. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Her father was nowhere in sight. He must have been nearby. I assumed so. But for that moment, it was just the two of them. A man who'd given her his coat and a girl who'd been given something bigger than a coat. I watched until I felt like I was intruding, which was about 30 seconds in. Then I walked away. Different path. Long way around the park. I didn't want to ruin it. I did some asking around later. Not in a stalkery way. Just, the way you do when something stays in your head. I had a friend who worked in PR with someone who worked with someone who knew people in the regiment. That sort of chain. Here's what I learned. And I'm putting this carefully because I don't want to get any details wrong. After that day at the palace, Daniel had asked permission to visit the girl in hospital. Permission was granted. He went the next morning, in uniform. He brought her a small stuffed bear with a guardsman's outfit on it. She'd been thrilled. He went back the week after, and the week after that. It became a regular thing, not a publicity thing, not a charity photo op, just a man visiting a girl who was sick. He read to her. He brought her drawings his nieces had done. Once, apparently, he taught her how to do the slow guardsman's march in the hospital corridor, with her in her chair and him walking next to her, both of them counting steps under their breath. The nurses adored him. The girl's parents adored him. The girl thought the sun rose and set on him. And when she was finally well enough to come home, when the treatment finished and the doctors said the words you wait years to hear, the family invited him to the small party they had for her. He came. He sat in their living room in his civilian clothes and held a paper plate of birthday cake and laughed at the jokes her uncle made. I learned all this slowly, over months. And the more I learned, the more I understood what I'd actually seen that afternoon outside the palace. It hadn't been a single act of kindness. It hadn't been an impulse. The coat hadn't been the thing. The coat was just the beginning. What he'd actually given her, what he'd been giving her ever since, was something much harder to put into words. He'd given her a place, somewhere safe, somewhere warm, not a literal place but the kind you carry with you when the world goes cold. He'd made room for her, and he hadn't told anyone he was doing it.